Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving straight into a rigorous historical case study on Australia's macroeconomic policy response to a severe external deficit in the late 1980s. If you're studying higher level economics, this period is absolutely crucial. It serves as a foundational example of both the mechanics and the profound consequences of deploying aggressive macroeconomic interventions. To keep our analysis structured, we'll follow a problem-solution evaluation framework. We'll start with the current account deficit crisis itself, look at expenditure reducing policy theory, and examine the implementation of contractionary monetary policy. Then we'll review the economic outcomes and trade-offs before finishing up with an HL evaluation and its limitations. Section 1. The current account deficit crisis. Let's first establish the macroeconomic environment Australia was facing right after floating the dollar in 1983. By the mid-80s, Australia's current account deficit had blown out significantly, eventually peaking at about 6% of GDP. Now, for policymakers, this was an alarming figure. The real concern here wasn't just the number itself, but that it reflected a structural reliance on foreign debt. And worse, that debt was primarily funding domestic consumption rather than productive investment. Just to be precise with our terminology, a current account deficit indicates that the outflow of money for trade and income servicing is far exceeding inflows. A deficit of this size created a systemic vulnerability. The economy was heavily exposed to the risk of a sudden loss of investor confidence, which theoretically could trigger a currency collapse. The gravity of this situation was perfectly captured by then-Treasurer Paul Keating in 1986. He issued a stark warning that Australia risked becoming a banana republic. It's a derogatory historical term for a weak, debt-ridden economy, but it really highlights the prevailing fear at the time. Drastic macroeconomic reform wasn't just an option, it was deemed absolutely necessary. Section 2. Expenditure Reducing Policy Theory. So, faced with this mounting crisis, what macroeconomic intervention could policymakers actually use? Well, theoretically, governments can address a trade imbalance in two ways. Expenditure switching policies, which change relative prices to shift consumption toward domestic goods, or expenditure reducing policies. Australia leaned heavily into the latter. The strategy was to use contractionary monetary policy as an expenditure reducing tool, forcefully decreasing total aggregate demand to essentially kill off the overall demand for imports. The theoretical transmission mechanism here is pretty direct. First, the central bank raises interest rates. Second, higher rates suppress the consumption and investment components of aggregate demand. And finally, as consumption and investment fall, national income is lowered, which subsequently extinguishes the economy's appetite for imported goods and services. Section 3. Implementing contractionary monetary policy. Let's look at how the Reserve Bank of Australia, or RBA, actually put this theory into practice. In a very aggressive attempt to cool down the surging economy and rein in that current account deficit, the RBA escalated the official cash rate dramatically. By January of 1990, the rate had hit a staggering 17.5%. Even by historical standards, this is a highly punitive level of monetary contraction. This intense contractionary measure was implemented with specific transmission targets in mind. Higher interest rates meant higher mortgage repayments, consciously designed to leave households with less disposable income for imported consumer goods. At the same time, high borrowing costs deterred firms from expanding, reducing the import of capital equipment. Plus, it aimed to crush the double-digit demand pull inflation the country was experiencing, which was vital for restoring long-term export competitiveness. Section 4. Economic Outcomes and Trade-offs. As you might expect, applying this theoretical framework in the real world yielded some highly polarizing macroeconomic outcomes. Looking at the data from the early 90s, we see a stark dichotomy. On the positive side, the policy worked. The current account deficit fell as import volumes plummeted and inflation was effectively broken. However, the negative outcomes were profound. The policy triggered a deep recession, marked by a massive wave of business failures and overwhelming corporate indebtedness. This severe domestic contraction led to another famous quote from Paul Keating in late 1990. In a fascinating bit of political economic justification, he rationalized the downturn as the recession that Australia had to have. He was essentially arguing that this painful cure was an unavoidable necessity to correct the country's deep-rooted structural imbalances. But the human and economic cost of this trade-off was incredibly steep. Following the collapse of domestic demand, the national unemployment rate soared to over 11% by 1992. That represents a massive underutilization of the labor force and really highlights the severe social friction caused by expenditure-reducing policies.
Section 5. HL Evaluation and Limitations. For a higher-level economics analysis, it's not enough to just state the outcomes. We need to critically evaluate the specific failures and theoretical limitations of this approach. A primary limitation demonstrated here is the issue of time lags, which are inherent in monetary policy. The RBA suffered a significant recognition lag. They were unaware the economy was already sliding into a deep recession. Combined with the effect lag, the time it takes for policy changes to ripple through the economy, they kept interest rates destructively high for far too long, significantly amplifying the economic damage. Furthermore, this era perfectly illustrates a fundamental conflict of macroeconomic objectives. It shows Australian policymakers being forced to navigate the inherent trade-off between external stability, improving the current account deficit, and internal stability, specifically full employment. Ultimately, they made the deliberate choice to sacrifice domestic employment to forcefully correct external instability. Another critical evaluation point is the nature of the tool itself. Interest rates are a blunt instrument. They can't be targeted at specific sectors. This meant the contraction arbitrarily devastated domestic sectors like local construction and manufacturing that were completely unrelated to the initial import imbalance. It caused widespread structural damage well beyond the intended scope of the policy. Finally, we have to look at the expenditure-reducing irony in this case study. Those punitively high interest rates naturally attracted foreign capital seeking high returns. This inflow of capital caused the Australian dollar to appreciate. And of course, an appreciated currency makes imports cheaper and exports more expensive. This effectively counteracted the desired improvement in the current account deficit, representing a distinct failure on the expenditure switching front. As we wrap up this explainer, I'll leave you with a central question for your continuing economic studies. The Australian experience of the late 80s is a textbook example of the pain associated with expenditure-reducing policies. So, you have to ask yourself, do the devastating social costs and high unemployment caused by such a blunt instrument ever truly justify the correction of a trade deficit? Or are modern governments correct to prefer more nuanced, targeted supply-side reforms to manage external imbalances?